Camping had always been one of my favorite ways to get away from everything. The noise, the stress, the constant distractions of life. Out in the woods, with nothing but a tent, a fire, and the quiet sounds of nature, it was easier to breathe. My fiancée and I had been going on camping trips together for years, and over time we had built up a rhythm. Setting up camp, cooking, relaxing under the stars. We knew how to handle ourselves out there. Last summer, we planned a weekend trip to Arkansas, choosing a spot that wasn't too remote but still far enough from the main roads to feel isolated. The campground was spread out, with plenty of space between sites and thick woods separating them. It was the kind of place where you might hear someone in the distance but never see them, where the sounds of crackling fires and faint laughter disappeared into the trees before they ever reached your tent. We arrived in the late afternoon, setting up camp at a site near a small creek. It was perfect, flat ground, plenty of shade, and a good spot for our tent not too far from the fire pit. The air was warm but not unbearable, the humidity hanging low over the trees. The scent of pine and damp earth mixed with the smoke from other campsites, drifting through the air in lazy tendrils. By early evening, we had settled in. The fire was going, the grill was heating up, and we were starting to cook. I was flipping burgers while my fiancée poked at the fire, occasionally tossing in small sticks to keep the flame steady. The sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The sound of cicadas had started to rise, their constant drone filling the air. Then we heard it, a voice, distant but loud, cut through the background noise, sharp, urgent. A man's voice yelling. At first, I thought it was just someone goofing around, maybe a group of campers getting a little too rowdy after a few beers. But then I caught the words. Help! I froze, burger still in hand. My fiancé's head snapped up, eyes narrowing in the direction of the voice. Came again. Closer this time. Without thinking, I dropped what I was doing and ran. The sound had come from a few campsites over, just beyond the trees. My feet pounded against the dirt as I weaved through the brush, the undergrowth scraping against my legs. The smell of smoke and charred food faded, replaced by something sharper, metallic. Then I saw him, a man, standing near a picnic table, swaying slightly. His clothes were soaked in something dark, pooling at his feet in the dirt. For a split second, my brain refused to process it. Then I saw his leg. Blood poured from his ankle in thick, pulsing waves, pooling around his foot and seeping into his sock. It wasn't just a cut. It was gushing, spraying onto the ground in bright red streaks. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. My fiancée was right behind me, skidding to a stop as we took in the scene. I forced myself to move. Training from a first aid course years ago kicked in, apply pressure, elevate, stop the bleeding. My fiancée grabbed a towel from the man's table, pressing it hard against the wound, wrapping it as tightly as possible. Blood soaked through immediately. I turned and sprinted back to our campsite, nearly tripping over tree roots, my lungs burning. I grabbed my phone from the table, swiping at the screen with shaking hands. No service. I cursed, spinning in place. There was no time to wait for an ambulance, no way to even call for one. I ran back to the man, who was now sitting on the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. My fiancée had managed to slow the bleeding, but it wasn't enough. His foot twitched slightly, barely responding. I knew there was a hospital about 20 miles away, down winding back roads. A long drive in normal circumstances. Too long now. I made the decision before I could think too hard about it. I grabbed his truck keys from the picnic table, helped him to his feet as best as I could. He was heavy, leaning against me, his weight almost too much. We half carried him to his truck, throwing open the passenger door. My fiancée climbed into the back seat, still holding pressure on his leg. I jumped behind the wheel, turned the key, and peeled out of the campsite, gravel kicking up behind us. The road was dark, winding, nothing but my high beams cutting through the night. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. My heart was hammering, but I couldn't let myself think too hard about what was happening. The man groaned, his head tilting toward the window. His words were slurred, mumbled. Couldn't make them out. I pushed the truck faster. I wasn't good with blood. Never had been. Even small cuts made my stomach twist. But now there was no room for that. No time to think about the warmth soaking into the seat, the way it dripped onto the floor mats. My fiancé kept pressure on the wound, kept talking to him, though I barely registered the words. The road stretched on forever. The dashboard clock barely moved, each second stretching into an eternity. Then finally, lights. A dull glow in the distance. The hospital. I swerved into the parking lot, barely braking before throwing the truck into park. The moment the doors opened, the man slumped, his weight shifting. The floor mat beneath him was soaked, dark and sticky. The emergency room doors burst open as staff ran toward us. Hands pulled him from the truck, voices shouting orders, the world tilting sideways. I just stood there, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my hands slick on the steering wheel. Then, as the last of the staff rushed inside, the doors swinging closed behind them, I realized my legs were shaking. My stomach rolled, a wave of nausea hitting me hard. I barely made it to the bushes before I threw up. Minutes blurred together. My fiancé's hand found my back, grounding me. Eventually, we sat on the curb, waiting. The parking lot lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows. An hour passed, maybe more. Then someone came out, telling us he would be okay. 18 stitches. That was all it took to fix something that had almost killed him. If we hadn't been there, if we had waited for an ambulance, he would have bled out. We drove back to camp in silence. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across our tent. The grill was still open, the half-cooked burgers untouched. We tried to salvage the night, sitting by the embers, staring at the flames. It didn't feel the same. At 10:30 p.m., the sound of footsteps on gravel made us both tense. It was him, limping but alive. He looked at us, nodded. No words were needed. We had saved his life, and neither of us would ever forget it. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple: 10 days alone in the woods, completely off the grid, away from everything. No work emails, no ringing phone, no people. Just me, nature, and silence. I had done trips like this before, but never for this long and never this deep into the wilderness. The cabin I found was perfect. It was an old hunting lodge, built in the 1970s by a guy who had long since moved on. A friend of a friend knew the owner and told me I could use it as long as I respected the place. It sat about 20 miles from the nearest dirt road, tucked deep in the forests of northern Montana. No power, no running water, just a roof for walls, a wood stove, and a small well outside for drinking water. I packed carefully. Freeze-dried meals, a sleeping bag, a solar lantern, plenty of firewood, a rifle, a small axe, and enough supplies to last me. I wasn't planning to hunt, but the rifle was for safety. Out here, bears were a real concern, and I wasn't about to take chances. The hike in took most of a day. The trail was barely a trail at all, just an old path used by hunters years ago. By the time I reached the cabin, my legs were sore, and the sun was starting to dip below the trees. The place was just as I expected. Weathered wood, a sagging roof, a heavy wooden door with a rusty padlock. I had the key, and when I stepped inside, the smell of dust, old wood, and damp filled my nose. There was a single cot against one wall, a small wooden table, and shelves with a few rusted cans of food that I wouldn't be touching. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, its black iron surface slick with years of grime. A small window looked out into the trees, but it was so dirty it barely let in any light. I spent the first night settling in, stacking firewood, boiling water from the well, and making a small meal. I sat outside for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The deep woods have a different kind of silence. It's not quiet. It's full of tiny sounds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, the occasional snap of a twig. But there was something else, too. Something I couldn't quite place. A feeling like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I shook it off. First night jitters, nothing more. The first few days passed without much trouble. I spent my time hiking, gathering firewood, filtering water, and just enjoying the solitude. At night, I locked the door, made sure my rifle was close, and let the fire die down before sleeping. Then small things started to happen. The first was the footprints. On the fourth morning, I stepped outside and saw them. Fresh tracks in the dirt, leading from the tree line toward the cabin. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, but as I looked closer, my stomach tightened. Barefoot, human, they weren't mine. I followed them a few yards, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. They were small, maybe from a child or a small adult, and they had come right up to the cabin door. I tried to stay logical. Maybe a lost hiker? Maybe someone passing through? But 20 miles into the wilderness? Barefoot? That night, I locked the door and kept the rifle next to my sleeping bag. I barely slept, listening to every sound outside. The next day, I made a perimeter check. I found nothing at first, but then, near the well, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Pile of animal bones. Small ones, rabbits, birds, picked clean and stacked neatly in a little tower. I forced myself to stay calm. Could have been anything. Fox, a bobcat. Some animals hoard bones, right? But deep down, I knew better. That night, I sat in the dark, rifle in hand, waiting. The fire was low, just embers in the stove, and the cabin was silent except for my own breathing. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak of wood outside. The porch. I gripped the rifle so hard my hands ached. I waited, barely breathing. Another creak, then silence. I didn't move. I didn't look. I just sat there, heart pounding, until the first light of dawn crept through the filthy window. When I finally worked up the nerve to step outside, the footprints were back. More of them, circling the cabin. I needed to leave. I packed my things fast, shoving everything into my backpack. I kept the rifle slung over my shoulder as I stepped outside. The forest was still, the air heavy. I started down the trail, moving fast, constantly looking over my shoulder. I made it about 5 miles before I saw it. A deer carcass hanging from a tree. It was fresh. Blood still dripped from its torn throat, pooling on the ground. It wasn't the kill that scared me. It was the way it had been strung up, its legs tied with vines, its ribs exposed like something had been picking at it. I kept moving, pushing myself harder, sweat pouring down my back despite the cold. I wasn't alone out here. Someone was following me, watching me. I walked until my legs burned, until I couldn't go any farther. The sun was getting low, and I knew I wouldn't make it back to my truck before dark. I needed to find shelter. That's when I saw the other cabin. I hadn't seen it on any map, and it looked even older than the one I had just left. The roof sagged, the walls were covered in moss, and the door was missing. But it was shelter. I stepped inside, rifle ready. The air was stale, thick with the smell of rotting wood. There was an old table, broken chairs, and a fireplace filled with ash. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the far wall, scratched into the wood, were words. "Don't sleep." My hands went cold. I backed away, heart pounding. That's when I noticed the footprints. All around me in the dust on the floor. Barefoot. Dozens of them. I didn't stay. I ran. I don't know how I made it back to my truck. The whole way, I felt it. That awful, crawling feeling of being watched. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. I just moved, fast and desperate. When I finally reached my truck, the sun was nearly gone. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. And then, just before I turned the key, I saw it, in the rearview mirror, a figure standing at the tree line, small, hunched, motionless, watching. I didn't wait. I started the engine and tore down the road, not stopping until I was miles away. I never reported it. What would I say? I just know I'll never go back. And sometimes, late at night, I still dream of footprints in the dirt. I spent a few summers working as a camp counselor at a sleepaway camp tucked deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The kind of camp that had been around for decades, where the cabins were old, the trails were worn, and every counselor had a story about something weird that had happened over the years. It was the kind of place where the darkness felt heavier at night, where the trees swallowed the last bits of daylight and left everything feeling just a little too quiet. We always told ghost stories around the campfire. It was a tradition. The younger kids got the fun, silly ones, but the older campers wanted something scarier. Something that would stick with them when they lay in their bunks at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. I had my own go-to story, a tale about a ghost that killed people unless they gave him 2 of their teeth and 2 names of other people to take instead. It was the perfect mix of creepy and ridiculous, something that would make the campers uneasy but still let them laugh it off at the end. But the real trick, the thing that made it unforgettable, was what I did after. See, when I was a kid, 2 of my adult teeth never came in. I had gaps where they should have been, and for years I wore a retainer with 2 fake teeth to cover them. It was just one of those weird genetic things, nothing special, but it made for a perfect scare. At the end of the story, right before sending the kids off to bed, I'd quietly pop the retainer out and give them a big, wide grin, showing the empty spaces in my mouth. That moment, the realization in their eyes, the way the fear flickered into something real, was the best part. It was all harmless fun, until one summer, when something happened that I still can't explain. It was late July, the middle of the season. By then, the campers and counselors had settled into the rhythm of things. The newness had worn off, and we all felt comfortable, like we belonged there. The days were long and hot, filled with swimming, hiking, and endless games. The nights were cool, heavy with the scent of pine and campfire smoke. It was easy to forget the outside world existed. That night, my co-counselor and I had taken our group of campers down to the fire pit by the lake for stories. It was one of the last nights of the session, and we wanted to make it count. The fire crackled, reflecting off the water, and the kids huddled close together, wrapped in blankets and sweatshirts. The air buzzed with nervous energy, that perfect mix of excitement and unease that came with a good scary story. I told my usual one, drawing it out, letting the suspense build, watching their faces in the firelight. They hung on every word, eyes wide, breaths held. When I got to the end, when I told them about the ghost's demand for 2 teeth, I reached up and popped out my retainer. The reaction was immediate: gasps, shouts, a few kids scrambling back in pure, unfiltered terror. Perfect. We laughed it off, calmed them down, and sent them back to their cabins, still buzzing from the scare. My co-counselor and I stayed behind for a bit, letting the fire die down, enjoying the quiet. Eventually, we headed back to our own cabin, exhausted but satisfied. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't unusual. Camp was full of noises, the wind through the trees, the occasional rustle of an animal moving in the brush. But this was different. I lay still, listening. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the moon through the windows. My co-counselor was asleep in his bunk across the room, breathing slow and even. Everything was quiet. Then I heard it, a soft rustling just outside the cabin. Not the wind, not an animal. Something deliberate. I sat up slowly, my heart already pounding. The cabin door was closed, but the windows were open, letting in the cool night air. I strained my ears, trying to pick out the sound again. There it was, closer this time, a shuffling, almost hesitant, moving along the wall outside. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tight. My mind raced through possibilities. One of the kids sneaking out? A prank from another counselor? I swung my legs over the side of the bunk, my feet hitting the wooden floor. The boards creaked softly under my weight. The sound outside stopped. I held my breath. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the wind, the distant sound of the lake lapping against the shore. Then, slow and deliberate, something pressed against the window screen. Not hard, just enough to make it bulge inward slightly, like someone testing it. I flicked on the flashlight and aimed it at the window. Nothing. The screen was still, the woods beyond empty. My pulse hammered in my ears. I waited, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. A minute passed, then another. Finally, I let out a breath. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe I dreamed the whole thing. I turned off the light and lay back down, my body tense, my mind unwilling to relax. I stayed awake for a long time, listening, but the sound didn't come back. Morning came, bright and normal. The events of the night already fading into that strange, uncertain space between dream and memory. But when I stepped outside, stretching in the morning sun, I saw them. Two small, white shapes, sitting just outside the cabin door. Teeth. I stared at them, my stomach dropping. They looked real, smooth, slightly yellowed, like they had been there for a long time. I bent down, hesitating before picking them up. They were cold. Too cold for something that had been outside all night. My mind struggled for an explanation. A prank? Some kind of coincidence? But who would do this? I looked around. The woods were the same as always, quiet and still. Nothing out of place. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I took the teeth and buried them near the fire pit, deep in the dirt. Not sure why, but feeling like I had to. I didn't mention it to anyone. What would I even say? The rest of the summer passed without incident. But I stopped telling that story, and I never, ever took out my retainer at camp again. I moved into the house at the end of summer, in that stretch of time when the days were still long, but the evenings had a hint of fall creeping in. It was a small rental, plain and unremarkable, sitting at the end of a quiet street. A single-story house with 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a backyard that was mostly dirt and weeds. Nothing special, but it was affordable, and that was all that mattered to me. The previous tenant had left in a hurry. I could tell by the way certain things had been left behind. An old broom in the closet, a single chair in the garage, a roll of toilet paper still on the holder in the bathroom. The landlord didn't say much about it, only that the last guy had moved out suddenly and stopped answering calls. It didn't seem like my problem. First, everything was normal. I spent my days working from home and my evenings watching TV or scrolling on my phone. The house was old, and it made the usual noises, wood shifting as it settled, pipes clicking in the walls. Nothing that bothered me. Then I started waking up feeling strange. It wasn't just being tired. It was an exhaustion that sank deep into my body, like I hadn't really slept at all. My muscles ached, my back felt stiff, and my head was foggy. Some mornings, I found small bruises on my arms and legs, like I had been pressing against something hard in my sleep. I figured it was just from tossing and turning. Then, one morning, I found the front door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before. It was a habit, something I always did before bed. But there it was, unlatched. I checked the house, looking for signs that someone had been inside. Nothing was missing, nothing was out of place. I convinced myself I must have forgotten. The next night, I double-checked. I locked the door, tested the handle, even stood there for a few seconds just to make sure. The following morning, it was unlocked again. I started feeling uneasy. Then there were the noises. First, they were soft. A faint creak in the living room while I was in bed. The sound of something shifting in the kitchen when I was in the shower. I told myself it was just the house settling, but I started paying more attention. One night, I woke up to a sound coming from the hallway. A slow, deliberate creak. I stayed still, barely breathing, straining to listen. Nothing. In the morning, I found the hall closet door open. I knew I hadn't opened it. I pushed it shut and moved on with my day, trying not to think about it. But things kept happening. Small things. My keys weren't where I left them. The kitchen drawer was slightly open. The light in the bathroom was on when I knew I had turned it off. Little things that didn't seem big on their own, but together, they started to wear on me. Then I started waking up with my blankets pulled off. Some nights, I would wake up shivering, my comforter bunched at the foot of the bed. Other times, it was gone completely, lying in the hallway outside my room. I started locking my bedroom door. But one morning, I woke up and found it unlocked. I tried to tell myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe I was so exhausted that I was forgetting things, moving things around without realizing it. Then I saw the attic hatch. It was in the hallway ceiling, just a small wooden panel with a pull-down cord. I hadn't thought about it much, hadn't even looked up at it since I moved in. But one day, I noticed it was slightly ajar, just a crack, enough to see darkness beyond it. I grabbed a chair and pushed it shut, making sure it was tight. The next day, it was open again. I felt sick. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every soft sound made my skin crawl. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft, steady noise. The sound of something moving above me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then silence. I lay there, heart hammering, until the sun came up. As soon as it was light, I grabbed my keys and left the house. I drove around for a while, trying to clear my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. I needed to know. I went to a hardware store and bought a long metal pole, the kind used to change light bulbs on high ceilings. When I got home, I stood beneath the attic hatch, gripping the pole in both hands, and pushed. The hatch lifted easily. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. Nothing. I reached up, hooked the pole into the latch and pulled. The hatch swung down, revealing a dark opening. I hesitated, then grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen. I aimed the beam into the attic. There wasn't much up there, just exposed beams, a thin layer of insulation, a few old boxes covered in dust. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then I saw the blankets. 3 of them laid out neatly in the corner. Next to them, an empty water bottle, a pile of food wrappers, and a small, worn-out shoe. I stood there, my mind struggling to catch up with what I was seeing. Someone had been living up there. Someone had been coming down at night. I backed away, my hands shaking. I left the house immediately and drove straight to a motel. I didn't go back until the landlord sent someone to check the attic. They found a small hole in the side of the house, just big enough for someone to squeeze through. The latch on the attic hatch had been loose. I moved out the next day. I never found out who had been up there. I didn't want to. Hiking had always been something I did to clear my head. I wasn't reckless, but I enjoyed pushing myself, going deep into the wilderness, where I wouldn't see another person for miles. That was the appeal, the quiet, the solitude. This trip was supposed to be just another one of those. A 3-day solo hike through a remote canyon in the desert. No marked trails, no crowds, just me and the open landscape. I had planned every detail. I had studied the maps, packed extra water, brought my GPS and a paper map as backup. I wasn't expecting to get lost. I wasn't expecting to find something that shouldn't have been there. Day one, I parked at the trailhead early in the morning, stepping out into the cool desert air. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. I strapped on my pack, adjusted my gear, and set out. The first few miles were easy, the ground mostly flat, dotted with low shrubs and dry riverbeds. The canyon walls rose in the distance, towering cliffs of red rock, cut deep by centuries of wind and water. That was my destination. By midday, I had descended into the canyon. The air was hotter down there, the walls rising high on either side, blocking most of the wind. It was quiet, the only sounds my own footsteps and the occasional bird echoing off the rock. I followed a dry stream bed, navigating around boulders and patches of loose sand. The plan was to hike deep into the canyon, find a good place to camp, and then explore some of the side passages the next day. Everything was going as planned, until I found the footprints. They were faint, half covered by sand, but they were there, barefoot, and they weren't human. The shape was wrong, long, too narrow, the toes splayed in a strange way. I crouched down, running my fingers over the edges. Fresh. Within the last day or two, I glanced up, scanning the canyon around me. Nothing, just rock and silence. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I had found a decent spot to camp. Flat ground, some natural cover from the wind. I set up my tent, ate a quick meal, and sat with my back against a boulder, watching the light fade. The silence felt different now, heavier. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, convinced I had heard something outside my tent, a shifting of sand, a soft, deliberate movement. But every time I listened, there was nothing, just silence. Day 2, I woke up early, feeling uneasy but determined to finish what I had planned. I left most of my gear at camp and set out to explore one of the side canyons. It was narrower than the main path, winding through high walls of rock, the sky barely visible overhead. An hour in, I found something strange, a structure. At first, I thought it was just a pile of rocks, but as I got closer, I saw it wasn't natural. A rough shelter built against the canyon wall. Small, maybe 5 feet tall, made from stacked stones and dried mud. It didn't look old. Someone had built this recently. I stepped closer, my pulse picking up. The entrance was low, just a dark opening in the rock. I hesitated. Then I noticed something near the entrance. Pile of bones, picked clean, sun-bleached. Some were animal, small skulls, ribs, but some were bigger, too big. I turned and left, moving fast. I didn't run, not yet, but I didn't stop. By the time I reached camp, the sun was sinking. I packed my things, my hands moving quickly. I wasn't staying another night. I started hiking back, pushing myself hard. I could make it to the canyon entrance by morning. Then I heard it, a sound behind me, soft, footsteps in the sand. I didn't turn around. I kept moving, faster. The sound kept pace. Then I smelled it. Rot, thick and sour. I walked faster, my breath coming short. My heart was hammering. Then up ahead, something moved. A shape stepping out from behind a boulder. Tall, thin, watching. I didn't think. I ran. I didn't stop. Not when I tripped. Not when my legs burned. Not when the canyon walls seemed to press in around me. I ran until the sun rose, until I saw my truck in the distance, until I was safe. I don't know what I saw in that canyon. I don't ever want to find out. I moved into the house at the beginning of fall. It was a quiet neighborhood, full of older homes, the kind where every driveway had a different model of sedan parked in it, and the lawns were neatly trimmed but not perfectly maintained. The house itself was a simple single-story with an attached garage and a small backyard enclosed by a wooden fence. It wasn't anything special, but it was mine, and that was enough. I had found it through a private landlord who seemed eager to rent it out. He wasn't pushy, just quick. The lease was ready the day after I toured it, and when I moved in, I noticed a few things that made me wonder if the previous tenant had left in a hurry. Scuff marks near the front door like something heavy had been dragged. A single plate left in the kitchen cabinet. A few stray nails in the garage wall where something had been hung. Nothing alarming, just little things. The first few weeks were uneventful. The house creaked at night, but that was normal for older homes. The floorboards would pop as they settled. The pipes would click when the water ran, and the wind sometimes made the fence rattle. I kept myself busy with work and unpacking, making the space my own. Then I started noticing small things out of place. It started with my keys. I had a small dish on the counter near the front door where I always put them when I came home. One morning, they weren't there. I searched the entire house, counters, tables, even the bathroom, before finding them on the floor near the couch. I told myself I must have dropped them without realizing it. A few days later, I found the back door unlocked when I was sure I had locked it the night before. It wasn't wide open, just slightly unlatched. I tested the lock, made sure it worked, then brushed it off as a mistake. Then there was the attic hatch. I hadn't thought about it at all when I moved in. It was just a small panel in the ceiling of the hallway, one of those pull-down types with a ladder inside. I had no reason to go up there, but one morning, as I walked to the bathroom, I noticed it wasn't completely closed. It wasn't hanging open, just shifted slightly so that one corner didn't sit flush with the ceiling anymore. I stared at it for a while, trying to remember if it had always been like that. I grabbed a step stool, reached up, and pushed it shut. That night, I woke up to a sound, a soft creak like weight shifting on wood. I lay in bed, listening, my breath shallow. Could have been the house settling, or the wind, or something else. I waited, staring at the dark ceiling. Nothing. In the morning, the attic hatch was open again. I called the landlord. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I just said I had noticed it wasn't shutting properly and asked if there was anything I should check. He told me not to worry about it, that it was probably just old hinges or insulation pushing against it. I didn't believe him. That night, I locked my bedroom door. Sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up to another sound, a slow, deliberate creak. It came from the hallway. I held my breath, listening. The sound didn't come again, but I could feel something was different. The air felt heavier, like someone was standing just outside my door. I stayed awake until morning. When I finally worked up the courage to check, the attic hatch was wide open. I should have left then, but I didn't. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the latch was broken, maybe air pressure was causing it to shift. But deep down, I knew someone had been in my house. I set up a camera, just a cheap one I bought online, pointed it at the hallway with a motion sensor. That night, I locked every door, checked every window, and went to bed. At 2:47 a.m., the camera sent an alert. Motion detected. My phone buzzed on my nightstand. Half asleep, I grabbed it and opened the app. The live feed showed the hallway. The attic hatch was open, and there was a figure. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. Person, barefoot, wearing dark clothing, crouched at the top of the pull-down ladder, head tilted slightly as if listening. My blood ran cold. The figure moved, slowly, carefully, one foot onto the top rung, then another. They were climbing down. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car, hands shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. I drove straight to a hotel and stayed there for the night. The next morning, I called the police. They found signs that someone had been living in the attic, old food wrappers, a small blanket, and a plastic bottle filled with urine. The attic had a small access panel leading to the garage. The lock on it was broken. I moved out that day. I never found out who they were, and I never went back. I had been hiking alone for years. It wasn't about proving anything or chasing some big life-changing moment. I just liked the quiet. The world had gotten too crowded, too loud, too connected. Out there, in the deep woods, it was just me and the trail. No emails, no news, no traffic. Just the sound of the wind through the trees and the crunch of my boots on dirt. This trip was supposed to be like any other. A solo trek through a section of the Idaho wilderness that barely saw any foot traffic. I had planned a 5-day loop, about 40 miles through thick forest, across 2 mountain ridges, and down into a remote valley where a long, winding river cut through the landscape like a scar. It wasn't a marked trail, just an old hunter's route I had found on some outdated maps. That was part of the draw. Fewer people meant fewer problems. I packed light but smart: tent, sleeping bag, extra layers, a stove, enough food to last the trip. I had my Garmin with me, fully charged, and an old-fashioned compass as backup. Bear spray, a knife, a first aid kit. Everything I needed, nothing I didn't. I started early, just as the sun was coming up. The first few miles were easy, a gentle incline through a dense pine forest. The trees were tall and packed close together, their trunks dark with age. The trail was barely a trail at all, just a faint path in the dirt, almost swallowed by time. The air was crisp, cool, and filled with the scent of damp earth. By noon, I was deep in the woods, far from anything. The trees stretched in every direction, unbroken except for the occasional clearing where sunlight managed to slip through. I hadn't seen a single sign of another person. No footprints, no fire rings, no empty beer cans left behind. It felt like no one had been out here in years. That's when I found the first thing that didn't make sense. About 10 feet off the trail, half hidden in the underbrush, was a jacket. An old, faded green jacket, torn and crusted with dirt. I walked over and nudged it with my boot. The fabric was stiff, the color almost blending in with the forest floor. I hesitated, then I picked it up. It smelled like earth and mildew, like it had been sitting out here for a long time. But the thing was, it hadn't rotted away. It was weathered, sure, but still intact. The kind of thing that hadn't been here for years, maybe months, maybe weeks. I looked around, scanning the trees. Nothing, just silence and endless forest. I dropped the jacket and kept moving. The trail grew steeper as I climbed toward the first ridge. The higher I got, the thinner the trees became, opening up glimpses of the land below. A sea of dark green stretching out forever, untouched and wild. I reached the top by late afternoon. It was the perfect place to set up camp, a flat clearing with a view of the valley below. I pitched my tent, made dinner, and sat on a fallen log, watching the last light slip behind the mountains. That's when I saw the second thing. About 50 yards from my camp, at the edge of the clearing, Something was stuck in the branches of a low tree. It was small, dark, swaying slightly in the breeze. I stood up and walked over. It was a shoe, a single old hiking boot, dangling from a broken branch. I stared at it. The leather was cracked, the laces missing. It had been there a long time. I turned back toward my camp, my stomach tight. This was supposed to be an abandoned trail. No one had been out here in years. Then why did it feel like someone had? I barely slept that night. Every sound in the dark made my skin crawl. The wind through the trees, the shifting of branches, the distant call of some animal. I kept my knife close, my bear spray within reach. Nothing happened. At dawn, I packed up and kept moving. The trail dropped steeply into the valley, the ground uneven and littered with loose rocks. I took my time watching my footing. One bad step and I'd be stranded miles from help. By midday, I reached the river. It was wide, fast-moving, the water dark and cold. I found a shallow section and waded across, the icy current numbing my legs. I kept going, pushing deeper into the valley. The trees were thicker here, the undergrowth dense. The silence felt different, heavier. Then I saw it. In the middle of the trail, half covered in dirt, was a backpack. I stopped. It was old. The fabric faded, the straps frayed. A long tear ran down one side, spilling out a mess of soggy clothes and rusted gear. I crouched down and poked through it. A stove broken, a canteen empty, a map, the edges curled with moisture.
No wallet.
No ID, no sign of who it had belonged to. I looked around. The trees loomed overhead, thick and unyielding. I checked the ground.
No footprints.
No sign of an animal dragging it. It was just there. I stood up, my heartbeat slow and heavy. Something was wrong. I kept walking. The valley stretched on for miles, endless trees swallowing the sky. The trail twisted and turned, disappearing into the undergrowth. Then, in the late afternoon, I found the third thing, the tarp. It was draped over something, just off the trail. My hands felt cold as I walked toward it. I hesitated. Then I grabbed a corner and pulled. Underneath was a pile of bones. Animal bones. At least that's what I told myself at first. But as I looked closer, my stomach dropped. Some of them were too big. The tarp slipped from my fingers. I turned and walked away.
Fast.
I didn't stop. Not when my legs burned. Not when my breath came in ragged gasps. I hiked through the night, my flashlight cutting through the dark. Every rustle in the trees made my skin crawl. I felt it. Something watching, something just beyond the edges of the light. By dawn, I was halfway up the ridge, my body screaming for rest. I didn't care. I needed to get out. The second I had service, I hit the SOS on my Garmin. They found me by midday. A ranger, young and confused, asked if I was hurt. I told him no. I didn't tell him about the jacket. I didn't tell him about the boot. I didn't tell him about the tarp. I just asked how far the nearest town was. He pointed down the road. I started walking. I haven't been back since. The disappearance of James Hunter, I don't know how to start this. I guess I'll just say what happened, exactly as I remember it. My name is Nathan Carter. I'm 31 years old, and I love hiking. I've been doing it since I was a teenager, weekend trips, backcountry trails, solo expeditions. I'm not an expert, but I know how to handle myself in the wilderness. That's why I can't explain what happened last fall. It started with a missing person. The trail that wasn't their James Hunter went missing in October. He was an experienced hiker just like me, liked the quiet, the solitude. He wasn't reckless, wasn't the type to take stupid risks. He told his family he was going on a 3-day hike in the national forest about 6 hours from my town. He never came back. They searched for weeks. They never found him. I don't know why I fixated on his case. Maybe because he reminded me of myself. Maybe because I had hiked in that same area before. Or maybe because I felt like I could find him. I don't mean that in a heroic way. I wasn't trying to be some kind of rescuer, but I knew the woods and I knew how people got lost. If he had fallen, if he had gotten disoriented, there had to be clues. So, a month after he disappeared, I packed my gear and drove to the trailhead. It was late November, cold but not freezing. The trees were mostly bare, the ground covered in dry leaves. The official search had ended weeks ago, but I wasn't expecting to find a body. Just something, a sign, anything. I started early in the morning. The first few miles were familiar, well-maintained trails, clear markers. I followed the same route James had taken, retracing his last known steps. Then I reached the part where he supposedly vanished. The problem was I didn't see how. The trail was clear. No sudden drop-offs. No thick underbrush that could have hidden a fall. If he had gone missing here, it had to be because he left the trail. I looked around, searching for anything unusual. That's when I saw the other path. It wasn't marked. It was barely visible, just a faint indentation in the ground, leading off into the trees. Almost like an old trail, long abandoned. I checked my map. It wasn't on there. The first mistake, I don't know why I followed it. Maybe I thought James had done the same thing. Maybe I was just curious. Either way, I stepped off the main path and started walking. First, it was fine. The trail, though faint, was still there. It wound deeper into the woods, the trees growing closer together. The air felt heavier, like the forest was pressing in. Then I saw the boot. It was half buried in the dirt, covered in leaves. The leather was cracked, the laces frayed. It looked like it had been there a long time. I nudged it with my foot. It didn't move. It wasn't James's boot. I knew that right away. It was too old, too weathered. But it meant something. Someone else had been here before. I kept walking. The cabin, the trail got harder to follow. The trees grew thicker, the underbrush tangled. I checked my compass, trying to keep track of my direction. South, slightly southwest. Then I saw the cabin. It was small, made of dark wood, barely visible through the trees.
No windows.
Just a single door, slightly open. I stopped. There was no reason for a cabin to be here. The national forest wasn't private land. No hunting lodges, no ranger stations. And yet, here it was. I stepped closer, my boots crunching over leaves. The door creaked as the wind pushed it slightly open. Inside, it was dark. I took out my flashlight and shined it inside. Empty.
No furniture. No debris.
Just a wooden floor, covered in dust. Then I noticed the scratches. Deep grooves in the wood, running in random patterns. Like someone had dragged something heavy across the floor. Over and over again. I backed away. The forest felt too quiet. Then I heard something move. Not inside the cabin. Behind me, the feeling of being watched. I turned fast, my heart pounding. Nothing. Just trees. Just silence. But I knew I wasn't alone. I listened, holding my breath. The air was thick, unmoving. The smell of damp wood and dead leaves filled my nose. Then a branch snapped. Closer this time. I didn't wait. I turned and walked back the way I had come. Fast but not running. The trail was harder to follow now. It was like the trees had shifted, the path less visible. I kept my compass in my hand, checking my direction. South, slightly southwest. I kept walking. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. The boot, the same one I had seen before. I had walked in a circle. The descent into panic that wasn't possible. I had been walking in a straight line. Hadn't I? I took a slow breath, forcing myself to think. I wasn't lost. I had a compass, a map. I just needed to reorient myself. I turned, adjusting my direction. North. I walked, Minutes passed, maybe an hour. The sky was darkening, the air colder. Then I saw the cabin again. The chase I ran. I don't know why I ran, but I did. Branches whipped against my face, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get out. Then I heard footsteps. Not mine. Something else. Running. Behind me. I didn't turn around. I sprinted, lungs burning, legs shaking. Then a break in the trees. The road. I stumbled onto the dirt, nearly collapsing as I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, not looking back. The final clue: I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station miles away. I got out, leaning against the car, my hands still trembling. That's when I noticed something stuck to my boot. Piece of paper, old, yellowed, torn. One word was written on it in shaky, uneven letters. Run. I never went back. I was hauling a load of lumber out of Oregon, headed for a distribution yard in Nebraska. It was supposed to be a straightforward trip, just interstate driving, a couple of planned fuel stops, and maybe a quick nap at a rest area if I needed it. I had been driving long haul for over a decade by then, so nothing about this trip felt unusual. I left the yard around noon, got through the mountain roads without issue, and hit the open highways by early evening. The truck was running smooth, my load was sitting right, and I had a good stretch of road ahead of me. I figured I'd push through until at least midnight before pulling over for some rest. The first part of the drive was peaceful. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the road, but the skies were clear. Traffic was light, just a few other truckers rolling along, the occasional car passing by. I had the radio on low, sipping from a cup of coffee I had grabbed at my last stop. I was somewhere in Idaho when I saw the car. It was just sitting there on the side of the road, barely visible in the fading light. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but something about it seemed off. It wasn't just broken down. It looked abandoned. The hood was up, but there were no hazard lights, no signs of movement. I glanced at it as I passed. The driver's side door was open. No one was inside. I kept driving. Things like that happen all the time. Someone breaks down, maybe they walk to get help, maybe they get picked up by another driver. But something about it unsettled me. About 20 miles later, I saw another one. Same make, same model, same open door. That was when my gut started telling me something was wrong. This wasn't normal. I had driven all over the country, seen my fair share of weird things, but two abandoned cars, same type, same situation, just miles apart? That didn't sit right. I kept my speed steady, watching my mirrors, scanning the road ahead. Maybe it was some kind of coincidence, or maybe there was an explanation I wasn't seeing. Then I saw the third one. This time it was in the middle of the highway. I hit the brakes hard, my tires screeching against the pavement. My trailer groaned under the sudden stop, the weight shifting behind me, but I kept control. The car sat there, no lights, no movement. My headlights washed over it, and that's when I noticed something else. The windshield was covered in something dark. Thick streaks, like someone had smeared mud or grease across the glass. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I wasn't about to get out and check. I eased my truck to the shoulder, keeping my eyes on the mirrors. The desert stretched out on either side, nothing but open land, but something about it felt wrong, like I wasn't alone. I took a breath, shifted into reverse, and started backing up. My trailer swung slightly as I maneuvered, my eyes flicking between my mirrors and the road ahead. Once I had enough space, I cut the wheel hard and pulled back onto the highway, rolling past the abandoned car as I picked up speed. I didn't look inside, didn't want to know. The road ahead was empty. The road behind me stayed dark. I kept driving. Maybe an hour passed. I had put enough distance between me and that stretch of highway that I started to feel a little better. The night air had cooled, my rig was running smooth, and I was getting close to the state line. Then I saw the headlights. Far behind me, just 2 tiny pinpricks of light at first, but they were moving fast. Too fast. I kept my speed steady, watching in my mirrors as the lights gained on me. My pulse picked up, my hands tightening on the wheel. It was a car, dark-colored, same make, same model. I exhaled slow, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just some guy in a hurry, flying down the highway. But I knew better. The car got closer, close enough that I could see it was the same as the ones I had passed earlier. Same shape, same dark paint, moving fast but staying just behind me. Then the headlights cut out, just gone. My breath caught in my throat. I checked my mirrors. Nothing but darkness. I kept driving. My pulse pounded in my ears. I didn't know what was happening, didn't know what I had gotten myself into, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't stopping. Another hour passed. I kept my rig steady, rolling through the night, waiting for something else to happen. Then, just as I started to think maybe I had outrun whatever this was, I saw the taillights, not far ahead, sitting in the middle of the road. A car, dark-colored, facing the wrong way. I didn't slow down, didn't stop. I gritted my teeth, checked my mirrors one last time, and kept going. The car loomed closer, my headlights hitting it full force. The driver's side door was open, and this time there was someone standing next to it. A figure, just a dark shape in the glow of my high beams. I didn't see a face, didn't want to. I hit the gas. My truck roared past, my trailer rocking slightly from the air pressure, and then the car was behind me, swallowed up by the night. I didn't stop until I hit the next truck stop, a well-lit place with plenty of other rigs parked around. I pulled in, shut off the engine, and sat there for a long time, breathing hard. Nothing on the news. No reports of abandoned cars. Just another quiet night on the highway. But I never took that route again.